Could it be that there are biological factors that predispose someone to criminal behavior? What might those biological factors be? This screencast is a brief introduction. We'll cover this in far more detail during the rest of the semester. And don't neglect your textbook, because the textbook goes into detail and covers the specific studies, which I won't do here. So don't neglect that. But what is it? Is there something that drives criminal behavior? Is it something in the genes? Is it brain structures, neurotransmitters, hormones? What could it be? Well, this really brings us to the old nature versus nurture debate. I like that picture there. And this debate has gone on for a long, long time. You might remember John Locke's conceptualization of the tabula rasa that was later basically taken up by Watson. So he thought that he could take any child and based on environmental interactions or nurture, he could get them to become a doctor, a lawyer, or a criminal based on how you reinforce that behavior. But on the other side, are there genes, the nature side? Is there something that drives behavior? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter primarily, but you'll see in a little bit that this nature versus nurture debate might not be as valid as we once thought it was. So how can we study the impact of genetics versus environment on criminal behavior? Take a second to think about that. What could we do? Well, we could look at DNA, and we've had the ability to do that since the 90s. But how about before that? Is there any way that you can think of that we could study the impact of genes versus environment? If you really think about it, your DNA, every cell in your body has your complete set of genetic code. There you can see the DNA helix. That makes you what you are, who you are. There's the DNA helix there. But we haven't had the ability to read your genetic code for that long. And you know what? Frankly, that's pretty expensive. And we could identify specific genes. But there's something more to this. What if we looked at twins? Not these kind of twins. You might be too young to remember that movie. It wasn't a very good movie. But more like these kind of twins. Mary-Kate and Ashley there. They're identical twins. So theoretically, they're basically like clones of each other. They start off with the same DNA. So what if we could take identical twins or monozygotic twins and compare them to fraternal twins or dizygotic twins, and we look at their behavior. Now, researchers have been doing this in the field of psychology and medicine for years and years and years. So if you have an identical twin that has, let's say, schizophrenia, you have roughly about a 50% chance of having schizophrenia yourself. One of my favorite disorders, ADHD, is one of the most highly heritable disorders. And if your identical twin has ADHD, you have about a 75% chance of having ADHD. Now, the fraternal twins, it's far less. So what that does is it gives us an idea as to the impact of those specific genes. Because you have your identical twin, you have your fraternal twin, and theoretically, you're raised in the same environment. Now, these two look different, but they look similar enough. And I would hope that their parents would treat them roughly the same and their classmates, but genetically they're very different. Over here, genetically identical. So just to review this, identical twins start from one fertilized egg. Okay, they're a single zygote that divides into two monozygotic twins or identical twins. So this is the same DNA. The DNA here in these two cells is identical, but these two cells later develop into two people. Now, fraternal twins or dizygotic twins, here you have two eggs, two fertilized eggs. So they have similar but not identical genetic material. Now, I don't know too many twins. And if I really think about it, I guess I knew one set of identical twins growing up. And they were pretty similar. However, you could definitely tell them apart. I mean, they looked a lot alike. Once you got to know them, though, they were a little different. Why is that? Think about the twins that you know. The identical twins. Are they really identical? Okay, so we have these identical twins. And we like to think that the mother here and the father, who's probably off watching TV somewhere, is going to treat these children the same. So they're going to have a shared environment. And they have shared genetics. In contrast to the fraternal twins that would have totally shared environment, but then different genetics. And what we can do then is come up with concordance rates. So that's a percent of monozygotic versus dizygotic twins. So you can see the impact of the genetics in contrast to the impact of the environment. All right, this is a little hard to see here. Sorry about this. But this says, although identical twins Stephen and Robert Bruce Safalski were both killers, each acted alone, unaware of the other's homicidal tendencies. In prison, Stephen was quoted as saying, "I thought I was the only murderer in the family." What if we took criminals, like twins, and we could find sets of monozygotic versus dizygotic twins and look at the impact of the genes there? So you would identify sets of twins and then look at criminal behavior. So you would find one twin that's a murderer, and then you see if the other one is as well, in both the monozygotic and dizygotic pairs. And you would hope that the monozygotic would have a much higher concordance rate. That would show you the impact of the genetics. So, I mean, I don't really think anybody's done this study, but we could do a large prison study where we identify one pair of twins that is currently incarcerated, and then we would locate the other twin and figure out if they had a similar criminal background. That's how that study would be done, or that research would be done. Now, there's something else that we could do, and this is a little different. Gerald Levi here and Mark Newman, you can see that those guys look kind of similar. They're identical twins. And I just want you to note, though, that look at Mark here. Same genes, Mark is significantly heavier. Exact same genes, different weight. So this isn't perfect. But what's unique about these two is that they were separated at birth. So they were put up for adoption, and they were adopted to different families. Now, they stayed in roughly the same area, but look at these two. And I don't know if they really looked this similar before they met each other, but they have a lot of striking personality characteristics. In fact, they both are firefighters. And that's how they realized that they were identical twins, because a fellow firefighter said, "Hey, you look just like this guy that's a firefighter 60 miles up the road." They met each other and realized that, hey, I'm adopted, you're adopted, and they figured out that they had this shared history. So researchers in the area of personality have been doing this work for a long time. If you've taken personality psychology, there's a good chance that you've seen pictures of these two guys, because they're pretty famous. Okay, but, there's a problem here. And that we think that identical twins have identical DNA. Do they? Well, I don't quite think so. Now, there's one weird thing. There's dichorionic and monochorionic monozygotic twins. And so that's like a single placenta versus a two placentas. So that's the first thing. So that prenatal environment might actually be different. Now there's something else that's far more relevant here. And these are called epigenetic factors. And here, what happens is that your environment impacts your genes. Like you have this huge genome, but it is not always like on, okay? So genes are expressed. They're either turned off or they're turned on. Genes typically code for proteins. Proteins are the building blocks of life. Everything in your body is made up of proteins. And the genes are the plans for those proteins. Okay, so what happens? Well, your environment signals your genes when to turn on and when to turn off. This field of study is called epigenetics. Okay? So, I know this example sounds really bad, but I use it frequently, and in Florida, in South Florida, there's a large homeless population. And when you look at the feet of the homeless in Florida, frequently they don't wear shoes. So what do their feet look like? And I know this sounds like politically incorrect, but it's a good example. So those individuals that walk around barefoot, there's lots of people that walk around barefoot all the time. They don't have to be homeless. But their feet get really, really thick. So they have genes that react to the environment that change the thickness of their feet. Had they been wearing nice comfy shoes and taking care of their feet wouldn't look like that. But they have the genetic material to respond to the environment like that. You have that too. If you play guitar, you might have calluses on your fingers. The body is going to change in response to the environment. That's epigenetics. So even though you have this genome and you have a twin that has the exact same genes, any sort of environmental differences are going to affect how those genes are expressed. So, even though you have identical genes, it's not like you're really identical. And again, sorry, this is kind of hard to read, but this is a quote, and this is similar quotes in your book here. In reviewing both twin and adoption studies, research suggests that genetics contributes moderately to criminal behavior, more so with nonviolent crime. However, environmental factors are also very important. And that's from Adrian Rain in a literature review of all these studies. And there's been over 100 studies like this in this area. But you know what? Like, it's really difficult to draw conclusions from this. And the major thing that you need to take out of this is that nature versus nurture debate is dead. It's over. So if someone ever asks you, is that like nature or nurture? Let's say schizophrenia. You always say, well, it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture. So I like to think of it as nature via nurture. So you will have genetic predispositions to things, but environmental factors have to come in order to see the expression of those genes. Okay? Now there's other factors that this chapter goes into. Psychophysiology a little bit. So I'm sure you've heard, criminals are fearless. They don't respond to fear the same way that non-criminals do. And to some degree, that's correct. So their nervous system does seem to respond a little different. Maybe you'll recognize this guy. This is Travis Pastrana. There he's doing a double backflip on a motocross bike. He seems to be totally fearless. Why is that? Is there something different with his genetics or his biology, psychophysiology? Yeah, actually, there probably is. And you may have seen this before, and we have talked about this earlier in the class. That's an old polygraph. And what the polygraph measures is your physiological reactions. And when they hook people up to machinery that measures physiological reactions and show them graphic images, people that are violent or antisocial don't respond quite the same. Now, does that mean that that causes the criminal behavior? No. No. We can't say it's causative. It's a correlate to the criminal behavior. So it's like the chicken and the egg. Which came first? We don't know. But they're related. Now, what might that be? And usually what you see is lower levels of arousal in antisocial or psychopaths or murderers. Lower levels of physiological arousal. Well, we'll talk about that in just a second. But the first thing that I want to talk about is temperament. So your temperament is like your disposition, how you are. Think about this with little kids or babies. What's their temperament like? And you'll hear parents say, oh, Susie is such a good baby. She's so easy to take care of. She never cries. And then other parents will say, oh my God, this kid is a nightmare. He's up all night crying. You may have heard of colicky babies. So what is colic? And it's different in horses. I mean, in horses it's a different thing. In babies, what is colic? Now, I've heard many a doctor say, well, the treatment for colic, what you do is you take a vacuum cleaner and you put it in the baby's room when they're all upset. You turn the vacuum cleaner on. That soothes the baby so they'll go to sleep. The funny thing is that the doctors might say that, but what that really does is it drowns out the crying so the parents don't hear it so they can go to sleep. That's that kid's temperament. It's their disposition. And your temperament is really stable throughout your entire life. So if you are a cranky baby, you're going to be a cranky adolescent, teenager, and adult. And there are other factors, like prenatal factors. So there might be birth complications, exposure to toxins like nicotine, alcohol, drug exposure. Alcohol exposure can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome, although it's a lot less rare than we thought. And there's some evidence that shows nicotine, alcohol, and drug exposure being correlated with ADHD, but the research isn't great there. So there might be prenatal factors like that lead to later criminal behavior. And then there's going to be neurological factors. We're going to talk a little bit about the frontal lobes. And the amygdala we'll talk about in later chapters. Same with hormones, neurotransmitters. And then disorders like epilepsy. Could those be the root of criminal behavior? Well, one famous case that I'd like to bring up, and the book talks about briefly, is Phineas Gage. So I'm sure you've heard of Phineas Gage. Every introduction to psychology class should cover Phineas Gage. But he worked on a railroad, and what he was doing is constructing the railroad, and so they had to blast a lot of rock. And what they would do is they would drill a hole into the ground, and then they'd put some dynamite or explosive down there, and then put some sand on top of it with their little wick, and then they would take a rod and they would pack it down in the hole. That rod was called a tamping rod. And so Phineas Gage was a really good worker, hard worker, nice guy, went to church, saved his money. And one day, as he was using that tamping rod, he was leaning over the rod, and something happened, probably a spark, ignited the dynamite, and it shot the rod up through the hole like a bullet, and it went right through his eye here, and then up through the top of his head. This is actually a picture of Phineas Gage. This is a real guy. And you can see he wasn't that disfigured. I mean, he lost an eye. And maybe the way people treated him afterwards contributed to his behavior. But more importantly, he lost a good chunk of his brain in the accident. Now, after this thing went up through his head, he stood up. He could walk around. He got some help. He survived. I mean, he was just fine. But a good chunk of his brain was taken out. Now, he probably should have died. And he did have a near-death experience, so you got that. But you can see the path of this tamping rod. And it basically took out his frontal lobes. And we have seen a pattern of behavior in many, many patients that have similar injuries. In fact, if you get a frontal lobe injury, you'll probably have similar behavior. And what we call the skills that the frontal lobe are responsible for are executive functioning skills. So like executive, like an executive in a company, those skills that you need to plan out your life. So it's thinking ahead in the future, planning, stuff like that. Phineas lost that, and his personality also changed. That's the actual tamping rod right there. They found these photographs in like 2010. They thought this was like a photograph of a whaler and this was a harpoon, but it's not. That's Phineas, and that's a tamping rod. And he traveled around after his injury. He took the rod with him. He traveled all over North America and South America, and he lived a pretty functional life. But the legend is that Gage was no longer Gage, was the quote from one of his co-workers. So he became a little more unruly. He would swear. He was quicker to anger. His work record wasn't as good. He probably stopped going to church. He changed. And when people have frontal lobe injuries, they become far more impulsive. And a lot of times they get into trouble. So maybe it's dysfunction with the frontal lobes. We'll talk about that more. The next person that I want to talk about is Hans Eysenck. And there he is right there. And the book goes into far more detail about this. I want to talk about this briefly. So we have introversion over here and extroversion over here. Now Eysenck had, this is like on a scale. So on one end you have introverted people, and on the other end you have extroverted people. And what he said was that this is all about central nervous system arousal. So remember, go back, that picture of Travis Pastrana on the motorcycle, or that little kid on the skateboard at the top of the hill? What does that mean in terms of Eysenck's theory? Well, introverted people, he said, have a lot of central nervous system arousal. And so any type of stimulus pushes them way over the edge. They don't like it. So they're introverted. They don't seek out exciting activities. They stay within themselves. They don't go outside. They don't interact with friends. They're introverted. And here are some of the character traits that are associated with people that are introverted. Unsociable, quiet, passive, careful. That kind of makes sense. Now let's think about somebody that's all the way on the other end. Somebody that's extroverted. If you don't know who Travis Pastrana is, think of like a daredevil, like Evel Knievel or something. So Eysenck said that extroverted people had very low levels of central nervous system arousal. That's why they're extroverted, because they need to get their arousal level up. So they go out, they're active, they socialize with other people, they do exciting things, because they need that level of central nervous system arousal to go up. So think about that. Now, I used to do an experiment in my classes where I would take those extreme lemon sour heads. I don't know what they're called. Atomic warheads, I think they're called. And I would give them to students, and I gave them a measure of introversion versus extroversion. And so we would figure out who the introverted students were and then the extroverted students. Then I would give them this really sour candy, and then have them measure the amount of spit that was produced in response to the candy. Now that's like central nervous system arousal. And the idea is that introverted people who already have a high level of arousal will respond a lot more. And they're not going to find that situation pleasurable. So they're going to produce a lot more saliva. Whereas extroverted people have that low level of central nervous system arousal. They eat that candy and it's just a little tiny bump up. Now, we never did statistical analysis, but that research study was done a long, long time ago, and I was trying to replicate that. And they show that that is, in fact, correct. Now, if we took an introverted person and showed them pictures of a violent crime scene and then measured heart rate, respiration, sweating on their skin, or galvanic skin response, the introverted person's responses should go way up. Whereas the extroverted person, they'll just have like a little tiny response. And so maybe it's this extroversion that has something to do with criminal behavior. Because somebody that's really introverted probably isn't going to be committing crimes. Over here, they might just do it to get excited. Now, stability versus instability. Or Eysenck talked about neuroticism versus like stability. And then he talks about psychoticism as well. So like that's like a psychopath or callous, unemotional behavior, which receives a lot of attention right now in the research. But let's just look at this emotional stability here. So over here would be the neuroticism, or emotionally unstable, and stable down here. So let's say somebody's extroverted and they're really emotionally stable. They might be talkative, responsive, easygoing, or lively. However, if you look at somebody that is emotionally unstable and extroverted, over here you're going to see restless, aggressive, excitable, changeable, impulsive. These personality characteristics over here kind of remind me of personality characteristics of criminal behavior. And then read about psychoticism as well, which has received less attention than these other two factors. However, it's a pretty provocative idea, and Eysenck's ideas really could explain a lot of criminal behavior. So again, do not neglect your textbook. Make sure you read this, because the text goes into detail about all the studies, and it has far more information than these screencasts. These screencasts are just hopefully I can add to the text material and help you engage in the material more. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Next week we will continue with the psychopath, which is probably my favorite topic, and we have some videos to watch too. So again, contact me if you have any questions.